Hello and welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. Brexit has played out over the past 8 years in often dramatic fashion. As a process rather than an event, it continues to play out, even if currently in less dramatic style. Today, Daithí Ó Ceallaigh, former senior Irish diplomat, and John Peet, The Economist's political editor, will discuss the current state of Dublin-London relations, matters related to Northern Ireland, the UK's relations with its continental neighbours, and the prospects for EU-UK cooperation. All this in the context, of course, of Britain in July having had its first change of government in 14 years, and the first since the Brexit process began 8 years ago. So with that, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. John, could we start with you in London? Could you give a sort of an assessment at this early stage of how the new Labour government is performing, and a little about the sort of economic and political backdrop, whether things are really as grim as we often hear from London?
Yeah, I think the truth is that Labour is proving a bit disappointing to many people. It won the election clearly, but its victory was more because the Conservatives did badly, and the Reform Party did well, and the Liberal Democrats did well. So Labour wasn't this wasn't a landslide in the sense of pro-Labour support. And since the election, I think the message that Keir Starmer has put out has been pretty relentlessly gloomy, very gloomy about the public finances, very gloomy about growth. And they're now talking a lot about the need to raise taxes, and they've already got rid of the winter fuel allowance for better off pensioners. So I would say the situation is not as comfortable for Labour as you might expect this close to that election. And some people are saying they need to up their game a bit.
And is your assessment, one of the things that struck me in recent years is just how downbeat many people, particularly in the economics business, have been on the UK economy. And yes, it certainly has not done well, but show me a big European economy that has done well recently. Is that sort of negativity that we see in much public discourse, is that part of the view, and is it actually having a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of investment and consumption and consumer optimism?
I think there is an element of talking ourselves into a very gloomy position in the economy. I mean, as it is obvious, for instance, that the UK economy is doing better than the German economy right now, but it's not doing all that well. And of course, that is a little bit bound up, I think, with Brexit. I mean, those who voted for Brexit, which was a narrow majority, believed that when Brexit was done, that would help the economy. It clearly hasn't helped the economy much, and I think that that's sort of contributed to a general mood of considerable gloom about the outlook. You keep reading how well the US economy is doing compared with the British economy, and indeed most European economies, although Ireland is an exception. But I think there is this sort of general mood of gloom, which I think probably is also not helping the Labour government.
And in terms of the Prime Minister and his cabinet, how would you assess in terms of how they've taken on their ministerial roles? Obviously, they've been out of government for so long, very little experience. Have they started well, competently, or are they still finding their feet?
I think they're still finding their feet. I think Starmer is showing himself to be competent, but I mean, in a way, Rishi Sunak was also competent. I mean, the contrast for Britain has been with the two previous prime ministers, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, who clearly showed themselves not competent. But I think, I don't think there is a big contrast between Sunak and Starmer. They both seem perfectly capable people. People believe that they're going to do the best they can. But in terms of all the other sort of portfolios, Chancellor and Health Secretary and so on, I think it's early days. They have a bit of time to show themselves competent, but they have got work to do.
Good. Maybe shifting over to a Dublin perspective, and more specifically on Ireland-UK relations. How do you assess the scale of the change? Clearly, there'd been a lot of bad blood with the Conservatives over the way Brexit was handled and the negotiations around Northern Ireland. Is that all water under the bridge now, or are there residual elements there that will continue? Like, as I mentioned at the beginning, Brexit's a process rather than an event. Will this continue to be a problem in relations, or is it all in the past and we can look forward to getting back to sort of relations as they were pre-Brexit?
No, I don't think we'll ever get back to the sort of relationships we had before Brexit, because there was an extraordinary relationship that developed between London and Dublin while both were members of the European Union. A lot of common interests and people meeting in the corridors every second day of the week. That's gone. In terms of the relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom, we're on the side of the EU side of the table, and it's the opposite side of the table to the UK. Having said that, I think there's been an extraordinary change in the relationship between London and Dublin since the change of government. I mean, it's no secret that the relationship was pretty bad, really from the time that Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. But not only in terms of Northern Ireland, but also because we were seen by the British as being on the other side of the table, and so our interests were different. I think it has changed since the change of government. When Starmer was here a couple of weeks ago, they agreed a joint communique. They agreed that both Ireland and the United Kingdom were co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. That was language that had not been used by the Tories for a very, very long time. They said that they would have annual summits between the two governments at the level of Prime Minister and Taoiseach. That's something that we had talked about 20 years ago, but had never succeeded in getting. And it's something I think that is seen in Dublin as very important. And they also agreed to establish 4 sort of areas: security, justice, and global issues, climate, energy, technology and innovation, growth, trade and investment, and culture, education, and people to people. The 4 areas where the two governments would try to seek to carry forward relations between them. So I think there's been a serious reset in the relationship. Now, that's not to say that everything is rosy. It's not. There are areas where there are significant differences, like, for example, on legacy issues. But there has been a very serious reset in the relationship, in my view.
I just missed what you said there about just before the second last thing you said in terms of still problems.
Well, there are still issues where there are significant differences between the two governments, particularly in legacy in Northern Ireland. The last British government, unilaterally and against the advice from Dublin, went ahead with a strategy which in effect gave immunity to the security forces for whatever might have happened in the past in Northern Ireland. And as you know, victims in Northern Ireland, on all sides, by the way, nationalists and unionists, loyalists as well, were very unhappy indeed at these legacy proposals. The British government, this current government, have agreed to have a look at this. They have rescinded the immunity conditions, but they're still going ahead with, or they seem to be going ahead with most of the arrangements for investigating what happened in the past. And the victims in particular in Northern Ireland are not satisfied. And the Irish government on this particular issue is guided by victims. So this is still a problem, this legacy issue. Right. But in other areas, there's been a lot of progress.
I don't want to divert too much into that, but just more in terms of the politics of this. The Irish government, of course, took a case to the European Court of Human Rights on this issue, and it hasn't withdrawn that with the change of the new government. Just given the broader political context of opposition on the right of the political spectrum in Britain, and I think the front runner for the Conservative Party has made it a point that he will withdraw Britain from that whole framework. It just seems to me that if by Ireland using that structure against Britain, it may not be in its own long-term interests. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe it would have been a better thing to withdraw the case with the new government and start afresh.
I don't think, and this is very personal, I don't think the Irish government will withdraw the case until they're reasonably happy that whatever arrangements, new arrangements the British government will make, and the British government are thinking about this, are acceptable to the victims.
John, just in terms of other bilateral relations, Britain and resets, very high-profile visits to Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor and French President, after coming to office. Again, how much substance is there in that? How much of a change is there? How important are those? How much has changed in bilateral relations, particularly with France and Germany?
I think quite a lot. I mean, there is no there is no secret that most European countries wanted Starmer to win the election. I mean, the truth again is that Sunak had done quite a lot to improve relations, also with some of these leaders, particularly with Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. But I think Starmer, by going very quickly to see Scholz more than once, and by hosting this meeting of the European political community in Blenheim soon after he came to office, has done a lot to improve bilateral relations with the big countries in Europe. What he hasn't yet done is done much to improve relations with the European Commission. I mean, of course, the European Commission is only in the process of being reformed after the new Commission was selected. But Starmer has not yet met von der Leyen, as far as I know. And I think, there is more work to do on the bilateral relationship with the Brussels institutions. But I think in terms of sort of bilateral relationship with the big countries, yes, I think that it's pretty good. They would like to see a more positive view of the European Union, and they're a bit sort of, nervous about the fact that Starmer insists on having red lines, no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement, and has rejected even talk of a youth mobility deal. But I think the relationship is much improved, even so.
And in terms of the security situation in Europe, it's clearly been utterly transformed in the past couple of years since the Russian invasion. Even the Draghi report last week on the European economy put a lot of emphasis on just the simple need for democratic Europe to have the capacity to build and maintain its own defense armaments industry, defense capabilities. Is that an area where, given the UK is traditionally having one of the strongest militaries in Europe, is that something that can be a bridge to greater cooperation, or are there limits to that, given the single market, the role of the single market in even armaments and any defense related manufacturers?
It's a good question. I mean, it is clear. David Lammy, the new foreign secretary, has talked about this many times. It is clear that under the new British Labour government, there is a desire to have a much closer foreign policy, security, and defence relationship with the rest of Europe. I mean, partly because there is still quite a lot of nervousness about who might win the American election in November, but certainly in terms of the fact that there is a war going on in the continent of Europe, the importance of the link between the UK and the other big sort of defence players, particularly France, I think is something that the Labour government sees very strongly. Whether it is going to be possible to use that, and the fact that both sides would see benefit in defence, foreign policy, and other forms of security cooperation, whether you can use that to then say, well, look, actually, we'd also like better terms for our access to the single market, and we might like some other deals. I'm much less certain about that. I mean, it is actually something that Theresa May tried when she was Prime Minister. She thought she would be able to use defence and foreign policy as a sort of a lever to extract better terms from the rest of the European Union. And I think most European countries, including France, despite it being a very key defence ally of the UK, will be very nervous about being seen to allow, that lever to be used. So I'm not sure that it's going to be very easy for the British government to get better terms in terms of single market by using the defence sort of bit.
Right. And so when Starmer went to Berlin, the spin coming out of that was that everything was going to be reset. It just reminded me so much of the Brexit process when the German car manufacturers would force Merkel to give Britain a good deal. Where the EU has competence, it's not in the gift of even the German Chancellor or the French President to dictate how the relationship, the EU-UK relationship works. I wonder, is that just still not fully understood by senior politicians in Britain, or is it a desire not to sort of appear to be reopening stuff with the EU and just letting that dog lie, given how much it's upended British politics over such a long period of time?
I think there is a nervousness even within the Labour government. I mean, Keir Starmer made very clear which side of the argument he was on when the referendum happened, and even after the referendum, he was quite keen to retain the option of remaining in the European Union. And I think Labour supporters, Labour MPs, all consider Brexit to be a terrible mistake, and would like to find some way of at least putting it right and possibly even reversing it. But at the same time, yes, I think Labour is quite nervous about seeming to make that a top priority. So there isn't much sort of, there's not much ambition around the government in terms of trying to improve the relationship with the EU. And Starmer has set his red lines. Whether they really understand how the EU works, I think he does. I have talked to him not since he became prime minister, but I've talked to him many times over the years. And I think he's very interested in the European Union. He understood it, and he understood how it worked, and he made very pertinent criticisms of how Boris Johnson and others handled the negotiations. But it is true that not everybody, there is this sort of residual feeling that maybe we could sort things out with Berlin and Paris, and not necessarily have to involve Brussels. And I think that's a mistake.
Daithí, just back to the security, you mentioned that it was one of the four areas that the two governments had agreed to focus on. I suppose in Ireland, there's still, even just, despite the Wall Street Journal had a cover story earlier in the week that the number of casualties in the Ukraine war on both sides has come to 1 million people, both dead and injured. Here in Ireland, I just don't get the sense, we have such a positive budgetary picture. We'll spend more time talking about where money is going to be spent rather than understanding the concerns of our EU partners about how serious the security situation is in Europe. Do you get any sense that the security issue in relation with in Ireland-UK relations is problematic? I'd note that earlier in the year there was a report which two former defence ministers put their names to, Conservative and Labour, highly critical of Ireland as an open back door for British security. Do you see that as being a problem in the relationship now that your security and the threats have changed dramatically since 2022?
I don't think it's a problem in the relationship between the two governments. That particular report that you mentioned was drawn up by a very right-wing think tank. There are security problems on this island, and there are traditionally defence problems on this island. The capacity of our defence forces to undertake any sort of action, be it on land, in the air, or more importantly at sea, is very limited. I think there's an understanding here that there's a need to beef up our defence capacity in view of the vulnerability in Irish waters and in the Irish space of, for example, the cables that go between Europe and North America, or the energy cables between Britain and Ireland. So they're the sort of things I think they will talk about. I note that in that joint statement, under security, the areas that they mentioned was that the UK and Ireland have a shared interest, for example, in cybersecurity and maritime security. So I do think things are changing here. I think the sort of acceptance of neutrality as the first purpose of the state, I think that has changed. I think there's more interest in the political class, and I've talked to members of the Dáil about this. There's much more interest now than there was, say, 10 years ago in us having to play some sort of a role within the security and defence areas. So I do think there is concern here, and I do think we'll see changes over the coming years, but it will be slow.
I just personally note that the political class seems more interested in a conflict in the Middle East than in our own security, if that's not unfair of me to say as the chair of the event. John, did you pick up on that report earlier in the year? Do you see any sort of friction in the relationship, or a potential for friction, if Ireland continues to depend on the UK, and clearly budgets are very tight in the UK, and that there may be a less willingness to do those sort of air cover roles that the RAF performs? Is that something that could come down, in your view, could be an issue in the future?
I don't think it is really. I mean, I think there is certainly a feeling, particularly in the sort of right wing of the Conservative Party, that Ireland is a bit sort of trading on the UK when it comes to defence, and I think that feeling has been around really for years. I mean, you could argue it dates back to some extent to the Second World War, and even before. But I don't think it's a sort of issue that this British government is going to say, bang the drum and say, look, we want Dublin to pull its weight. There is a general feeling in Britain, and I think probably across most of Europe, that Europe collectively is going to have to do a lot more in the defence field in the future than it has in the past, because in a sense, if some people in Britain think that Ireland is trading on the back of Britain, I think there is a feeling in America, in both parties, not just in Donald Trump, there is a feeling in America that the whole of Europe has traded on the back of the United States for far too long, and they are not willing to go on doing that forever. They expect Europe to do more in its own defence, and I think that
Oh, do you think that's? I think it's a very fair parallel. That I think it's unwise for Ireland to depend on another country for its own security. Is that a fair parallel?
Yeah, I think it is a fair parallel.
Okay.
Were you asking me, Dan?
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit unstable there.
No. I think it is a fair parallel. I think there is a rising feeling in government circles here is that Ireland needs to do more, not only in terms of increasing the amount of expenditure on defence, but also in participating, particularly with European colleagues, in other areas. Now, there has been some participation of that kind for quite a while, and it's not limited to the Middle East. But I mean, there is no doubt whatsoever that the amount of money that is spent by all European countries, but particularly by Ireland, on social welfare and health as a percentage of total government expenditure is much higher than similar expenditure in the United States. And it's one of the reasons why the defense forces in the United States are so good, is that they spend a lot more on defense than as a percentage of expenditure than do any of the European countries. But there have been a number of reports into the state of the defence forces, into the capacity of the defence forces in the last 2 or 3 years here, and I think we will see changes in coming years in the amount of expenditure on the defence forces here and on cooperation between Irish defence forces and defence forces elsewhere.
Interesting. It'll be interesting in the coming budget to see what sort of increased allocation the defence forces get. Coming back to economic matters and UK EU relations, John, you mentioned that you feel Starmer personally and the Labour government is well disposed, but is the constraining factor any sort of accusation that they are surrendering sovereignty? So, even arcane things like phytosanitary rules, if Britain were to dynamically align, in other words, accept EU rules, to what extent would there be a lot of noise politically saying that, oh, you're undoing Brexit, you're accepting rules from Brussels, and that, whether the public understands the technicalities of the issue and who does, but if is that a big constraining factor, and do you think it will continue to be a constraining factor on any sort of closer EU-UK cooperation?
Yes, I think the answer to that is it is a constraining factor. It's a constraining factor for two reasons, really. I mean, I think it is true to say that now that the United Kingdom is out of the European Union, even those who think that might have been a mistake might feel uncomfortable if the UK, as a non-member of the EU, just chooses to follow all the rules set by the EU without any say in them. I mean, we had this argument after the Brexit referendum itself. There were some people who said, why don't we become like Norway? Norway accepts all the EU rules despite having no say in them. And I think on all sides, people felt that would be an uncomfortable position for the UK to be in. And that continues to be the case. So I think there is a constraint there. The constraint is doubled, of course, because the Conservative Party may well choose to attack Labour on anything it does in this area, and even might go as far as to say, if for instance, you choose dynamically to align with all of the European Union's food and health rules in order to improve the terms of trade in food, that we'll undo that when we come back into office. And I think that that's going to make both sides rather more cautious about making progress in this area. And that's one of the reasons why Starmer has set down his red lines. He doesn't want to be sidetracked into a long argument about, is he trying to undo the Brexit vote? But he does also want to improve the relationship in economic terms, and trying to do that without, as it were, seem to undermine Brexit is going to be a real challenge for him in the next sort of year or two.
And Daithí, on subject to real challenges, with Britain out, and as you said, we're firmly on the EU side of the table. We're really in a sort of nightmare. I've described it in the past as a sort of strategic nightmare for Ireland. We have to have good relations with Britain, but we're part of the European Union, and that is a priority. Can we? Is there any prospect of sort of finding a new equilibrium in terms of how we can be members of the EU and have close relations with our nearest neighbour?
Well, if you look at the trade first and see how it's working in Northern Ireland, I'll give you an example of how we as it were can be in the two places at the one time. The Windsor framework seems to have bedded down. It seems to have bedded down politically. Gavin Robinson, the leader of the DUP, is committed to its implementation. It's working in the Assembly. There is a committee in the Assembly which meets regularly to look at the changing regulations coming from Europe. It has agreed practically to all of those regulations and are being implemented in goods which are coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And where there are difficulties, the Commission has been flexible. For example, the mercury fillings in teeth are being outlawed within the EU, but they're going to continue in the United Kingdom. And under the Windsor framework, they should, in theory, be outlawed in Northern Ireland. But the Commission has given a grace period for Northern Ireland for the continued use of mercury fillings until 2034. That's for another 10 years. So there seems to be a certain amount of pragmatism. The Windsor framework seems to be working, and I think it'll probably continue. That's not to say that there might not be difficulties, but I think it will continue. So those sort of thorny issues about the Republic being on one side of the fence in matters which are within the Commission's control, they say that they're being worked out quite flexibly. And there's a whole range of areas between Britain and Ireland where we are exceedingly close historically. And that's not going to change just because we're in the EU. I think the great loss between London and Dublin from Brexit is the fact that British and Irish ministers and British and Irish civil servants and trade unionists and whatever are not meeting all the time and just resolving those little difficulties that always arise in any relationship. And that's why I attach importance to the agreement in the last few weeks to have annual summits at prime ministerial level, because that sort of can take the tension out of differences, and differences can be sorted out as they come along. So I'm not in any way pessimistic about the future relationship between Britain and Ireland, but because I do think that if you have a government like this current British government, and as seems in Northern Ireland with the Commission, people can be flexible and sort some of these difficulties out.
And just one of those difficulties, Daithí, that arose as recently as the weekend when the British government decided not to fund that Casement Stadium in Northern Ireland. That seems to have blindsided the Irish government. How would you read that? Do you think that was just the British government overlooked informing them in advance? Do you think it was any thoughts on that?
I don't know, to be honest, whether they informed the Irish government in advance or not. I would suspect they did. I wouldn't be over concerned about it. There were difficulties in Casement Park. The agreement to upgrade a soccer stadium, a GAA stadium, and a rugby stadium was made, I think, in 2008 or 2009, when the notion to have a stadium on the former grounds of the Maze prison turned into a major stadium for all of them was vetoed by the then DUP leader, Peter Robinson. There was massive opposition in the housing estates around Casement Park to the rebuilding of that stadium. And I think a lot of that opposition remains. It was complicated by two other factors. Firstly, if Casement Park was going to form a ground for the European soccer, the European competition in 2 years' time, it has to adhere to Euro football rules, to FIFA rules, which cost more money. So the actual cost of the stadium went from something quite small to something massive. And in spite of the fact that the Irish government was prepared to give quite an amount of money, I think it was about 60 million, and the Assembly was prepared to give some money, there was a very large sum of money required from the British government. And I think, frankly, this decision was made purely on economic grounds.
Okay, Daithí, let's not go with so little time left with so many things to discuss. Let's leave that one there. So from the very local, John, to the bigger picture, Tim Shipman, the journalist who's written a huge amount about Brexit, I heard him recently make what I thought was a pretty implausible argument that Britain's influence in the world has increased since Brexit, given the freedom of the fewer restraints, shall we say, as he put it, of being an EU member. Would you go along with that? Do you see any advantages for Britain in terms of its wider foreign policy freedom? Is it more influential in any way outside the EU than it was inside?
Broadly, I wouldn't agree with that. I think not being a member of this very important club has diminished British influence in general terms. I mean, besides having done some damage to the British economy, I think what he may have had in mind, and there is something in this argument, but I wouldn't put it too strongly, is that being a non-member of the European Union does enable you, for instance, to link up more easily with countries in Asia. There is talk still of a possible free trade agreement with India one day, although experience says that India is not very receptive to free trade agreements, and Britain is trying to form some link with the comprehensive Pacific free trade area, and of course it's strengthening its links with Australia as well. But I don't think that adds up to Britain suddenly being an influential global player in the way that it was to some extent as an important member of the European Union. And I see that most clearly on the occasions when I still sometimes go to Washington. I think in America, they regarded British membership of the European Union, aside from Trump's sort of hostility to Europe in general. But if you put that on one side, they regarded British membership of the European Union as very important. And they saw Britain as their closest sort of ally inside the European club. And now that Britain's not there, I think that's diminished America's feeling that Britain matters.
And in terms of what often used to be, or maybe still is in London, the special relationship, how you've seen that evolve, with Brexit and without Brexit generally over the years. Is it still as important for the UK? It clearly is, but is it perceived as being, is the UK having less influence in the US?
I think it is perceived as Britain having slightly less influence. I mean, there's clearly a very special security relationship still, and I think that does count. And in many areas of security, including espionage, cyber security, Britain is an important player for the United States. But in general terms, I would say that Brexit has certainly not helped what is called the special relationship. Of course, British-US relations are close, and I think Starmer was very keen to go and see Biden. He's hoping to see him next week, and he's hoping, as I understand it, he's hoping to meet both candidates in the US presidential election, although that may prove hard. But Britain does matter. But I think in terms of when the next president, even if it were Trump, looks at Europe, they will continue to say, well, actually, the countries that matter most in Europe now are Germany and France, no longer the UK.
And Daithí, same question. As a former diplomat, you looking at the UK's role in the world, how would you perceive? Do you see? I imagine you would share John's view in general that Britain is less influential outside the EU. But are there any things that you could see where it has gained an advantage? Thoughts on that position?
I pretty much agree with practically everything John said. But Britain is an important player and will remain an important player. In defence matters, it's probably one of the two most serious players in defence matters in Europe. I think in the whole area of intelligence, Britain has an extraordinary record, and it has a relationship with the United States unlike any other. So there are very important aspects to Britain. One thing that's forgotten, I think, and it's something that really should be remembered, is Britain's colonial legacy. The image of Britain's empire in Britain is very different to the image of Britain's empire in the former colonies, and that includes not only in places like Africa, but that includes Australia and New Zealand. I remember talking to a New Zealander at the time, going back 4, 5, 6 years. It was in the context of Brexit, and it was quite a serious. This person had been quite a serious person in the New Zealand civil service, and he was talking about the possibility of a particular deal between New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and he says we haven't forgotten that when Britain joined the EEC, overnight, without any say, we lost our market for our butter. So there are historical things here. Same is true of India, which John mentioned. I mean, India is not really in favour that much of free markets and so on, or free trade. But there is a very strong anti-British feeling in places like India, and these things do matter. I think Britain has an influence. I think Britain will continue to have an influence, and particularly in areas like security and intelligence and defence. But I think they are measurably weakened by having left the EU, not only in terms of being part of a larger bloc that finds it easier to deal with, say, states like India or China, but the influence which the British had in Europe was immense. And on the whole, in my view, it was very positive. When we both joined the European Union, the language in the Commission, the language in Europe was French. It's now English. That's largely because of the contribution made by the United Kingdom. I think they've lost an immense influence by cutting themselves out of Brussels.
Yeah, well, certainly, I suppose any of us who watch the EU over the years, it was always astonishing to hear people in Britain who just didn't seem to understand how much influence Britain had around the table. And part of that was because of the civil servant. And John, you're a former civil servant. I'd be interested in getting your views as we come towards the end on the state of the civil service in Britain and the relationship between the two parties and the civil service, because it certainly strikes me that in decades past, the civil service was more naturally disposed to the Conservatives. And that has changed, and correct me if I'm wrong, but people in the civil service now will be more naturally disposed towards the Labour Party, and particularly around foreign policy issues, and in particular around the EU. If all that is true, does that make Labour's government, Labour's job in terms of conducting foreign policy easier than the Conservatives? They're more at one with their own officials?
I think there is something in that. Yes, I agree with that. I mean, you say I was a former civil servant. Indeed, I worked in Brussels for the British government once. I think yes, there is. I suppose you could go over history and say that the civil service is a broadly small c conservative institution. I think that's true in most countries, and that naturally
it's still the case.
I think that's still true. But I think, in terms of today's Conservative Party, I'd say the civil service is rather less in sympathy with today's Conservative Party than it was the Conservative Party, if you like, the Conservative Party of Edward Heath, and even to some extent Margaret Thatcher. But the civil service adapts, and I'm sure that's true in Ireland as well. They adapt when governments change. They're not immune from sort of changing moods. I mean, I think quite a lot of the civil service was actually quite enthusiastic about the victory of Tony Blair in 1997, despite being a relatively conservative institution. They joined the feeling of the country that it was time for a change. And I think this time round, they probably felt the same about Starmer. So in terms of sort of working with ministers, I think that will be somewhat easier for Starmer than it would have been had Sunak won again, and I think that will continue.
Good. And Daithí, in terms of Irish civil service, at that level, I know you've been retired for a while now, but in terms of the relationships between Irish civil servants, the DFA, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and their counterparts in the UK, any thoughts on how those relationships have been affected by Brexit, or whether there's still very strong connections and lines of communication?
Well, I think they're still very strong, but John's point about civil servants, able to change for different masters, I think is a very true one. For about the last 12, 13, 14 years, there have been regular annual meetings between the top civil servants in London and the top civil servants in Ireland. They sort of fell apart a little bit as there was a difficult situation between the two governments during the negotiation of Brexit. But they were always there. And they have been resurrected now with the change of government. I think an important point to say is that Keir Starmer, when he was the public prosecutor, Keir Starmer was a member of that upper echelon of civil servants. They meet every Wednesday, I think, in London, and he met with the permanent undersecretaries on a weekly basis when he was himself a civil servant. So he knows how the civil service works. He knows inside, as an insider in the civil service. There is so far, it seems to me, there is more respect for civil servants from the Labour government than there was at times from previous Conservative governments, where civil servants were outed, as it were. I mean, I know quite well at least 3 senior British civil servants who resigned from the civil service because of the manner in which they were being treated by British politicians. I don't think that will happen with this government.
Interesting.
If I may just add to that, Dan, I know we're running out of time, but I think the fact that Starmer has long experience in Northern Ireland, and so does his chief of staff, Sue Gray, long experience in Northern Ireland, it means that there is an instinctive sort of feeling about the importance of the island of Ireland, which I think will help to smooth the relations.
Yeah, I think that's true.
John, just very finally, it sometimes surprised me that during the Brexit negotiations and things got very heated, that the British didn't threaten to end the common travel agreement. I certainly never heard that came up as a threat. I wonder if you did.
I don't think it was ever a serious possibility, because I think actually the British people and the British government very much value the common travel area. And of course, when this came up in the Brexit context, I was constantly being told, well, look, this long predates membership of the European Union. We've had this since 1922, and we're not going to change it now. So the fact that we're leaving the European Union shouldn't have an effect on the common travel area. I think that's still true. And I think it may also be slightly relevant that Schengen itself is coming under quite a lot of pressure now from other countries, most notably Germany and the Netherlands. So I think the question for the future is going to be, how sustainable is the Schengen area itself?
Excellent point to finish on. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for your time. Thanks to our members who tuned in. Hope you found it as interesting as I did. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.